Hello, welcome to our very first video lecture here for Econ 365 Summer 2020. So in this lecture, I'm just going to go through a couple of introductory points about why to study development. So let's just go ahead and dive in. So what does it mean to be developed? So some of the questions that we're going to consider in this section here are what separates developing countries from developed. And it's not a clear sort of line of demarcation. There's a lot of sort of fuzziness right on the edge. There are some developed countries that certainly people living in those countries, including the US here, have very similar living conditions to those in developing countries. And there's certainly people in developing countries that have living conditions, on par with the wealthiest people in developed countries. So, you know, it's a nuanced question. We want to make sure that we're not, just painting with too broad a brush and saying this is a developing country, this is a developed country. But what we're really going to focus on are what are the characteristics that are most common in developing countries and less common in developed countries. So we want to think about, what are some of the differences in the factors that distinguish developing and developed countries across the world, right? So, are there huge differences in income? Are there huge differences in health? Huge differences in education? Differences in gender equality? These are all things we're going to take a look at. And then, how have these factors changed over time? Right. So some countries have grown really quickly, and they're countries that 40 years ago would have been considered a developing country. South Korea, for example, whereas today, is one of the richest countries in the world and has some of the highest living standards in the world. At the same time, there are countries that were poor 40, 50 years ago and are pretty much just as poor, if not poorer today than they were. And so we're also going to look at throughout the course of the semester why it is that some countries have been able to experience better growth paths, engage in more development than others. All right, so the first thing we'll just take a look at is the amazingly stark differences in GDP per capita across countries. And so this is, just sort of a selected list of GDP per capita across countries. GDP per capita is basically you take GDP, which measures the total value of a nation's production over the course of a year, and you then divide that by the population. So it's a really, really rough measure of average income in a country. So the basic idea here is that suppose you have the total income produced by a country and you evenly distribute it across everybody, then this is GDP per capita. Now, obviously, even in the most egalitarian, equal country, this is an overestimate, and there's going to be large differences in income between those at the top of the income distribution and those at the bottom. But it's a good first step to get a sense of how income differs between countries. And so, for example, if we take a look at Switzerland, which is making almost $84,000 per person, and then you compare that down to, for example, South Sudan, the poorest country in these rankings, making less than $300 per person per year, you can see that there's simply enormous differences in income per capita across countries. And so it'll be really interesting to see, and something we're going to look at is why do we observe these differences? What does this mean? What does it imply? How is it possible for somebody in South Sudan to live on less than $300 a year? And in fact, the average South Sudani that you meet probably makes less than this, given that this is assuming an equal distribution of income, and there's a lot of income inequality in South Sudan. So how is it possible that somebody can live on such minuscule wages and absolute poverty? We'll take a look at, what does this measure, and then perhaps more importantly, what does it not measure? And so you can see here the global rankings. You have a lot of difference here. Sorry, that's a little bit of a typo for Qatar. That actually should be 69,000 plus. But you can see here that there's a lot of differences. Even when we're talking about differences between developed countries, you got, South Korea coming in at 31,000, the UK at 46,000, and then you've got countries like Switzerland, Norway, well over, 70, 80,000, which is, it's up there. Okay, so income isn't everything. Certainly, it's a good first step to measure development, but it doesn't capture everything. So the other things that we want to consider are measures of health. So, for example, life expectancy. And so I've got this same list of countries ranked in terms of their GDP per capita. And then here we can see that, yeah, there is a correlation, certainly, between income and life expectancy. So the richest country, sorry, in the world, Switzerland, has a life expectancy of about almost 84 years. It's life expectancy at birth. Somebody born today, how long would you expect them to live on average? And then the poorest country has a life expectancy down at 57.6 years. So first off, how is it possible that we have such stark differences in life expectancy between countries? I mean, we're all the same species. We're all pretty much biologically the same. So how is it possible that somebody in Switzerland is living almost 30 years longer than somebody in South Sudan? Or if you take the longest lived country in the world, Hong Kong, and you compare that to the shortest lived country in the world, Central African Republic, it's more than a 30-year difference in terms of life expectancy. And so what we're going to see is that a lot of this has to do with child mortality rates. The biggest reason why life expectancy is low in some of these poorer countries is because they have really high rates of child mortality. And life expectancy has improved in the richer countries, mostly due to improvements in old age health. Okay. And so certainly income is a big driving factor of this, but it's not the only one. Income matters obviously for life expectancy. If you have better income, then you can afford better health care. Certainly, you're not going to have as many people dying of easily preventable diseases like parasitic infections, like a lack of both prenatal and postnatal care for mothers and children. But it's not the only thing that matters, obviously, because if you take a look here, let's look at the U.S., which has a higher income than, for example, South Korea, an income that's almost per capita twice as large as South Korea's. But on average, people in the US are expected to live 4 years less than the average South Korean. And so clearly, income isn't everything. You take a look again here, you got Russia, which is much richer, for example, than China on a per capita basis, but has much lower life expectancy. And so there's other things that do matter. Now, part of this is the distribution of income. Part of it is the quality of a country's healthcare system. And so we're going to look at some of these other factors that influence living standards, what it means to be developed, that are not purely income based. Now, this matters again because we do see that there's a strong link between income and those factors that we consider to be important for development. So, for example, literacy, certainly something that we think is important. And we do see a positive correlation between income, so this is on a log scale here, and literacy rates. And you see that as countries become richer, their literacy goes up. That makes sense. Richer countries have more to invest and spend on education. We should expect them to be more literate. That being said, there are definitely some outliers here. So just basically, this is a diagram where the size of each circle reflects the population of the country. So up here we've got China, there's India, this is the US here. But let's just take a look at a couple of comparisons. Zimbabwe is much poorer than Saudi Arabia. Despite that, the average literacy rate in Zimbabwe is actually higher than the average literacy rate in Saudi Arabia. And so how is that possible given Saudi Arabia's vast advantage in average income? And so this is something we're going to take a look at. A lot of it has to do with the distribution of income. The average Saudi that you meet living on the streets in Riyadh, for example, is not making as much as GDP per capita would indicate. A lot of the people that are living there maybe weren't born in Saudi Arabia, they're not citizens of Saudi Arabia, and that's certainly driving the literacy rate down simply because they don't have access to the same social services. Zimbabwe, a very poor country, suffered through a terrible hyperinflation a few years ago, but the literacy rate is actually pretty high. Again, we can take a look. Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest countries in the world. One of the countries that's been just ripped apart by years and years of internal conflict, has terrible indicators for almost every single measure of life of living standards. But despite that, actually still has a higher literacy rate than a lot of other countries that are richer. And so, why is it that some countries are above this line, meaning that they're doing better in terms of literacy than we'd expect, and other countries are below this line, meaning they're doing worse than we'd expect them to do based on their income? And so we'll take a look at why it is that some countries are able to translate their resources better than others into improvements in life expectancy. We can see this again when we look at child mortality rates. And so clearly there is, again, a strong negative relationship between income and child mortality. So this is the under 5 mortality rate. This is basically out of 1,000 children under the age of 5, this is the number that we expect to die. And so you can see here, if you're below this line, what that basically means is that your child mortality rate is lower than what we would expect given your income level. So you're doing a better job. If you're over this line, then what that means is that your child mortality rate is higher than what we'd expect given your income levels. And so, for example, if we take a look at Vietnam and Angola, two countries that have roughly the same income, and in fact, Angola's income is higher than Vietnam's, Vietnam has a child mortality rate that is a fraction of the ridiculously high child mortality rate in Angola. A lot of this certainly being driven by the source of income in these countries. So Angola, most of their income is coming from oil wealth. The same is true for Equatorial Guinea. These are countries that are very rich because of very vast natural resources. I don't want to call Angola very rich, but rich for sub-Saharan Africa, certainly. And this resource wealth that is driving income in these countries, we tend to see countries that specialize in natural resources having worse indicators for living standards than we would expect given their income. So this is something called the natural resource curse that we'll spend some time later in the summer going over. And we'll explain why it is that the source of wealth really does matter for how your living standards come out. So some of the questions that we're going to explore in this course, how do we measure development? And so hopefully one thing that you picked up right there is that we don't want to rely purely on income-based measures of development. We want to look more holistically at a lot of different measures that are there. We are going to ask the question, why are some countries poor? Why are some countries rich? Is this an accident in history? Are poor countries stuck in a poverty trap, or is it possible for a poor country, following good policies, maybe a little bit of luck, to become eventually a rich country? So why do some countries grow faster than others? Should we care about inequality? Right. And so within a country, there's certainly going to be people that have a lot of income. There's going to be people that have very little income. Is this just simply a byproduct of free market capitalism? Or is there a level of inequality within a country that is inefficiently high? And when I say inefficiently high, what I mean is that the country would actually be better off if we were able to reduce inequality. It would grow at a faster rate. Overall income would rise if we could reduce inequality. So we'll look at some of the arguments for and against high levels of inequality within a country. But then we're also going to consider cross-country inequality. Is this reasonable that we have, 100 times difference in income between the richest and the poorest countries? Is that, something that it's actually more than 100 times? Is that something that is sustainable, or does something need to be done to sort of narrow the gap in living standards between countries? And then we'll consider, to what extent is underdevelopment a local problem versus a global problem? So we mean this both in terms of causes. Are poor countries poor because of the actions that they took, or are poor countries poor because of the result of actions taken by rich countries? So here we'll consider things like colonial legacies. We'll consider whether or not the current global economic system is favored for rich countries and against poor countries. And then they're also going to think about the solutions. Is development something that needs to be done at the local level, or should there be some kind of international focus on improving the plight of the poorest people in the poorest countries? And then finally, is there a magic formula for development? And I'll just give you the answer right now. No, there isn't. So just two guiding principles that we're going to have throughout the semester. First off, the course is going to be data-driven in the sense that any theories that we present are going to be presented alongside empirical evidence that either supports them or refutes them. So we're never just going to make a claim and not back it up with some kind of research, some kind of firsthand, primary source data. And then second, a key theme is that there's not a single development theory that works for everybody. There's a theory that might work for one country, but it fails in another. And so what we need to do is we need to take into account the specific features of every single country to figure out, hey, this is going to work here, it won't work here, we need to adjust the policies a little bit.